When you buy a piece of flat pack furniture, there is this inherent expectation of mechanical precision.
Oh, yeah. Complete.
Right. You open the cardboard box, you pull out the little instruction manual, and the logic is just completely binary. Like tab A goes into slot B.
Yeah, it's very straightforward.
Exactly. You turn the hex key exactly 4 times, and suddenly, boom, you have a functional bookshelf. It is clean, it's predictable, and it is entirely void of emotion or, messy human psychology.
Right, because it appeals to our desire for control.
Yeah.
I mean, we naturally want complex things to be categorized, to be easily solvable with a neat little exploded view diagram.
Exactly. And for over a century, global pop culture has treated one of the most famous ancient texts in human history exactly like that flat pack furniture manual.
The Kamasutra.
I am talking, of course, about the Kamasutra. I mean, we collectively treat it like this slightly taboo coffee table book composed entirely of impossible acrobatics.
Yeah, like it's just a gymnast's guide.
Right. We just assume it's a mechanical guide to physical intimacy. But if you look at the actual source material for today's deep dive, that assumption just completely falls apart.
It really does.
So the question becomes, if it isn't just a catalog of gymnastics, what was its actual purpose?
Well, to answer that, we are relying on a pretty massive stack of research today, centered primarily around the Oxford World's Classics translation of the Kama Sutra.
Right. The one by Wendy Doniger and Sudhir Kakar.
Exactly. And this particular translation is fantastic because it strips away centuries of myth. It provides this really rigorous, unfiltered look at the original Sanskrit text.
Which was written a really long time ago, right?
Yeah, it was composed sometime in the 3rd century of the Common Era by a scholar named Vatsyayana Malanaga. And what the translation reveals is that this manuscript, it is a highly scientific, deeply psychological, and honestly, a surprisingly pragmatic textbook on the entire art of living.
I mean, it functions more like a sociological study of an ancient civilization. But to understand how Vatsyayana constructed this text, you have to first look at the philosophical bedrock of his world.
Precisely. Because in classical Hinduism, there is this overarching framework known as the Purusharthas, which basically dictates the 3 main aims of human life.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you have the classic triad. You have dharma, which is duty, religion, morality, and law.
Right.
You have artha, encompassing power, wealth, and worldly success. And finally, kama.
Which is pleasure and desire.
Right, and that doesn't just mean sexual desire. The sources point out it includes the sensual enjoyment of life art, music, good food, perfume.
Good things in life.
Exactly. But if dharma, duty and religion was the ultimate goal for society, wasn't there a massive conflict there? How did Vatsyayana justify dedicating an entire encyclopedic volume just to kama?
That is the big question.
Especially in a culture where you had ascetics and yogis who were literally fleeing the sensual world to meditate in isolation.
Well, that tension between asceticism and worldly pleasure, that was the central intellectual debate of his time. And Vatsyayana navigated it brilliantly.
How so?
He didn't dismiss the religious ascetics who viewed pleasure as an obstacle. Instead, he argued that pleasure, is exactly like food.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Right. He said it is biologically necessary to sustain the body and the mind. He firmly believed you could pursue all 3 aims in perfect balance.
Wow.
And to prove his philosophical detachment, he even claims at the very end of his work that he wrote the Kama Sutra in a state of chastity and the highest meditation.
Which is such a fascinating disclaimer for a book that dives so deeply into human desire.
It's very ironic.
He's essentially stating, I compiled this massive encyclopedia of passion while maintaining complete emotional and physical stillness.
Yes, exactly.
And you can actually see that disciplined, almost clinical approach in how the book is structured. Because it doesn't read like a diary, does it?
No, not at all. It reads much more like a classical Indian drama.
Right.
It has a very deliberate 7-act narrative arc.
Right.
Vatsyayana is essentially taking the reader through the life cycle of a privileged citizen. Act 1 sets the stage, detailing how a young bachelor should set up his home and his lifestyle.
Getting the pad ready.
Exactly. Then Act 2 transitions into perfecting techniques of intimacy. Then, as the narrative progresses, our protagonist seduces a virgin, navigates the complexities of marriage, deals with the politics of having multiple wives.
Right, because that was a thing.
Yeah. And then he inevitably gets bored and commits adultery, moves into the orbit of highly educated courtesans, and finally in the 7th act, he ages.
The twilight years.
Yeah, the final chapters deal with aphrodisiacs and magic spells. It's really the desperate attempts of an older man trying to keep his youth alive.
So if this is a seven-act play, the lead character is this archetypal man about town. And the text goes into granular detail about the curriculum this guy is supposed to be studying. I mean, he isn't just learning bedroom techniques. There is a mandatory list of 64 arts he has to master to be considered a truly cultured individual.
And these 64 arts are incredibly demanding.
I'll say.
They represent the high level of cultural refinement required to truly experience and facilitate pleasure. Like, it wasn't enough to just be wealthy. You had to be fascinating.
Right, looking at the list in our sources, these aren't just casual hobbies.
No.
Yes, he needs to know singing, dancing, and how to play the lute. But he also has to master architecture, woodworking, sleight of hand.
Magic tricks, basically.
Yeah, testing the purity of gold and silver, making intricate flower carts, and then you get to the incredibly niche skills, like teaching parrots and mynah birds to talk.
Right.
And quail fighting. It's like a modern, incredibly wealthy tech bro trying to master every esoteric hobby imaginable, but with way more poetry and daily foam baths.
It is exactly like that. And those specific arts might seem random to a modern reader, but they all serve a highly calculated social purpose.
Like the quail fighting.
Yes. Why quail fighting? Because hosting a quail fight allows you to invite the neighborhood's elite over to your courtyard, which displays your wealth and hospitality, and that builds crucial social capital.
Okay, that makes sense. And teaching a parrot to speak?
Well, it demonstrates immense patience and cultivation to your guests. Furthermore, trained birds were occasionally used to send covert, flirtatious messages to lovers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In a society with strict public boundaries, that was useful. Every single one of these 64 arts was a tool to curate an environment of absolute leisure and refinement.
It makes me think of a modern lifestyle architect, or just a true Renaissance man. It's the belief that to be an adequate lover, you must first have a perfectly cultivated mind and an immaculate environment.
Exactly.
The physical intimacy is just the final piece of a much larger puzzle.
And crucially, this rigorous education wasn't restricted to men.
Right.
The text explicitly outlines that women should learn these arts as well. But because of the societal restrictions of the 3rd century, women couldn't always study texts directly in public academies.
So how did they learn?
Vatsyayana suggests they learn the practices in private from a highly specific list of trusted female confidants.
Yeah, the sources mention they would be taught by a trusted foster sister, an aunt, an older servant, or even a female renunciant, which is essentially a nun.
Yes.
The idea of a nun privately tutoring a young woman in the Kamasutra is just a striking historical detail.
It really is.
It shows how pragmatic this society was about preparing people for domestic and sensual life. And the environment they are supposed to create for all this is meticulously detailed.
Because the physical space was considered just as important as the physical techniques.
Oh, absolutely. The bachelor's setup described in the text is incredibly vivid. Like, he has an outer bedroom specifically designed for entertaining. The bed is low in the middle and very soft. He's got a spittoon placed conveniently on the floor, a lute hanging from an ivory tusk on the wall, cages of pet birds scattered around, and outside in the orchard, a well-padded swing.
And every single item you just listed is an instrument for sensory stimulation.
Right.
The lute is for auditory pleasure. The flowers and incense are for olfactory pleasure. The soft bed and padded swing are for tactile pleasure. The entire house is just a machine designed to maximize kama.
So he's set up the perfect room, he's mastered the lute, he has the social capital. But from the sources, it seems like once another person actually enters that carefully curated room, Vatsyayana suddenly turns into a biologist.
He really does.
He just abandons the poetry and starts obsessively classifying people.
Yeah, this is a classic example of what the philosopher Michel Foucault would later classify as scientia sexualis, the science of sexuality.
Right.
Vatsyayana loved taxonomy. He categorized human beings physically to create a rigid framework for desire. Like, he classifies men by the size of their anatomy as hares, bulls, or stallions. And he categorizes women correspondingly, as does mares or elephant cows.
Which mathematically creates exactly 9 possible combinations of coupling.
Exactly 9.
With the equal couplings, so a hare with a doe or a stallion with an elephant cow being declared the ideal match, of course.
Of course.
But he doesn't stop at physical size. He catalogs 4 types of love, 17 ways of kissing, 16 ways of scratching with the nails, and 16 distinct ways of biting.
He basically attempts to map every conceivable human interaction.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back here. Why try to drop a literal mathematical spreadsheet over something as messy, emotional, and inherently unpredictable as human passion?
It does seem counterintuitive.
Doesn't counting out your 16 different types of scratches totally ruin the mood?
What's fascinating here is that Vatsyayana was highly self-aware. Like, he knew the numbers were somewhat absurd.
Oh, he did.
Yeah, he openly admits later in the text that there are simply too many combinations of human movement to truly count. The numbers actually served two distinct purposes.
Which were?
Practically, they were mnemonic devices. Memory aids designed to help students memorize a massive text in an era that still relied heavily on oral tradition.
Oh, that makes sense. It's way easier to remember a list of 16 specific things than an abstract concept.
Precisely. But the deeper psychological purpose was an attempt to tame the violence and animal instinct of raw lust. By putting numbers to it, by categorizing it into equal and unequal couplings, you take a chaotic biological urge and you turn it into culture. You refine it. You put a cage around the animal.
And you civilize it.
Exactly.
But the most revealing part of the sources we're reviewing is that they highlight the ultimate breaking point of this exact science. Because after spending chapters building this massive numbered taxonomy, Vatsyayana basically throws his hands up and writes this beautiful contradiction.
This is my favorite part.
He says, and I'm paraphrasing the sources here, when the wheel of sexual ecstasy is in full motion, there's no textbook at all and no order.
It is such a profound philosophical admission. He recognizes that true passion inevitably shatters the shastric cage, this rigid textbook structure of rules and classifications he just spent chapters meticulously building.
Yeah.
The spreadsheet just cannot contain the human spirit.
And because Vatsyayana realizes rules fail when passion takes over, he has to look at how humans actually behave when they break those rules.
Yes.
Which leads us directly to his shockingly pragmatic chapters on adultery.
Book 5.
Right. Book 5 of the Kamasutra, which covers other men's wives, it just completely pulls the rug out from under modern expectations. It abandons all religious morality for raw Machiavellian pragmatism.
The psychology in this section is incredibly intricate and, frankly, quite dark.
Yeah, it is.
The text lists the justifications a man might use to seduce a married woman, and they are entirely devoid of romance. They are ruthlessly calculated political moves.
They read like a political thriller, like a man might seduce a woman to manipulate her husband into turning against a mutual enemy. Or he might do it simply to access her wealth because he's run out of money.
Yeah.
And the most calculating example is seducing a woman because she knows a secret that could ruin him. So he compromises her so that she can no longer expose him without exposing herself.
It's basically blackmail.
Exactly. Or he uses her as a literal bridge to gain access to another higher status woman she happens to be friends with.
It is a toolkit for social survival and dominance.
It really is.
But while it is calculating, this section also reveals a significant progressive shift in how women were viewed within the literature of the time. Because before this text, in the older Indian epics, women were frequently referred to metaphorically as cooked rice.
Cooked rice.
Yeah, meaning they were viewed merely as passive items for indiscriminate consumption by men.
But Vatsyayana completely discards the cooked rice theory.
He does. He portrays women as having intense agency and complex internal lives. They have their own motivations for infidelity, their own political maneuverings, which the text explores with surprising empathy. Furthermore, Vatsyayana dedicates space to quoting a famous historical debate between two scholars, Adultery and Babravia, over the precise nature of female pleasure.
Which is wild.
Yeah, they were debating whether women experience a climax in the same way men do.
Just the fact that male scholars were debating the mechanics of female pleasure in the 3rd century is remarkable in itself.
It really is. Adultery argued that a woman's pleasure was akin to a continual itch being scratched, like a low-level constant.
Okay.
But Babravia argued that women experience a continuous, escalating climax from the very beginning of the act. The fact that a foundational textbook dedicates so much intellectual real estate to analyzing female pleasure proves that women were considered active subjects in this dynamic, not just passive objects to be acted upon.
And it isn't just the binary of men and women that the text treats with this kind of psychological observation.
No, not at all.
The sources explicitly detail the Kamasutra's highly nuanced view of what it calls the third nature. And it's important to look at exactly what the 3rd century Sanskrit sources say here, regardless of our modern societal debates. The text directly outlines behaviors encompassing homoeroticism and transgender identity, and it does so without the heavy moral condemnation found in the law books of the same era.
This raises a really vital question about how ancient societies viewed gender and sexuality outside the bounds of reproduction.
Right.
While other religious texts of the period actively prescribed punishments for homosexual acts, the Kamasutra takes a clinical, matter-of-fact approach.
Yeah.
It details intimacy involving a third-nature masseur, and notably, it uses female pronouns to describe the active partner in that dynamic.
Which shows an understanding of gender presentation that goes way beyond strict biological sex.
Exactly.
It also explores the psychology of women playing the man's role, referring to the woman taking the dominant position during intimacy, and that blurred the incredibly rigid gender lines of the classical period.
It definitely did.
The text suggests that when a woman acts like a man, she temporarily takes on male characteristics of ferocity and dominance before regaining her traditional female modesty afterward. It's a remarkably fluid view of gender performance.
It views human pleasure as a universal drive that exists across various expressions and identities. Vatsyayana observes these behaviors, he categorizes them, and files them under the broad umbrella of human experience without passing moral judgment.
His job was to document kama, not to police it.
Right, exactly.
So if the original Sanskrit text is this psychologically rich, gender-fluid, culturally specific masterpiece of sociology,
Yeah.
how did we end up with the modern sanitized punchline? Like,
So-
how did a text about the philosophy of desire turn into the flat-pack furniture manual of sexual positions?
To understand that transformation, we have to look at the history of its translation, specifically focusing on the Victorian era and the collision of cultures.
Okay.
Ah.
Enter Sir Richard Francis Burton and F.F. Arbuthnot in 1883. They published the first major English translation. Although, as our sources diligently point out, the heavy lifting of the translation was actually done by two uncredited Indian scholars, Bhagavanal Indrajit and Shivaram Parashuram Bede.
Yes.
Their names were essentially erased from the cover, leaving Burton as the famous Orientalist attached to the project.
And that 1883 Burton translation is the lens through which the West first viewed the Kamasutra. But as the translators of our modern Oxford edition clarify, the Burton text is severely distorted.
The analogy the modern translators use is brilliant. They say reading the Burton translation is like taking a precise scientific medical textbook and running it through a Victorian funhouse mirror.
It's a perfect description.
The shape is somewhat there, but the proportions are entirely twisted.
They altered the fundamental tone of the book. They padded the text heavily, taking crisp, aphoristic Sanskrit, which remember was meant to be easily memorized, and turning it into long, moralizing Victorian paragraphs.
Wow.
They turned direct, vibrant dialogue between characters into passive, indirect quotes. But the most significant alteration was how they managed to navigate the incredibly strict British censorship laws.
Right, because if Burton and Arbuthnot had translated the anatomical terms directly into clinical English, they would have been arrested and imprisoned for obscenity under Victorian law.
Exactly. So, to circumvent the law, they engaged in a linguistic sleight of hand. They substituted English anatomical terms with the Sanskrit words lingam and yoni.
Which fundamentally changed the context for anyone who actually understood Sanskrit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it completely skewed the meaning. First of all, Vatsyayana rarely used the word lingam and never used the word yoni in the original text.
did it.
No, he used much more neutral clinical terms like the Sanskrit words for pelvis or the instrument.
Interesting.
Secondly, by the 19th century, lingam and yoni carried immense religious gravity in India. They were terms intimately connected to the god Shiva and his consort Parvati. Using deeply sacred religious terminology to describe human anatomy in a manual about pleasure was highly inappropriate and inaccurate.
But for the prudish Victorian reader in London, it achieved exactly what Burton intended.
It did.
Our sources refer to it as the National Geographic effect. By keeping the words in foreign Sanskrit, Burton anthropologized the text.
Yeah.
It's the exact same psychological loophole that allowed early National Geographic magazines to publish photographs of bare-breasted African women decades before mainstream magazines could ever show white women in the same way.
Right.
It made the imagery foreign. It framed it as an exotic study of those people over there.
It allowed Victorian high society to consume the material under the guise of intellectual, anthropological curiosity, safely distanced from the reality of their own bodies. And because they leaned so heavily on translating the chapters, dealing with physical positions, which were much easier to translate than the complex cultural, political, and psychological nuances of 3rd century India, The Kamasutra became globally famous strictly as a catalog of exotic gymnastics.
The philosophy, the psychology, the 64 arts, all of the nuance was stripped away, leaving behind just the instruction manual.
Just for the manual.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. For you, the listener, the mission here was to completely reframe this manuscript. The Kama Sutra isn't a punchline about pulling a muscle in the bedroom. It is a beautifully complex third-century study of human nature. It captures our capacity for deep refinement, our ruthless ability to manipulate one another, and our underlying biological need for connection.
And reading through it, you realize human nature has remained remarkably consistent. As the researchers note, the text's highly specific advice for a courtesan trying to subtly get rid of an unwanted lover reads just as accurately and effectively today as it did nearly 2 millennia ago.
That's amazing.
The technology has changed, the architecture has changed, but we still play the same political games, we harbor the same anxieties, and we still seek the exact same pleasures.
The clothing changes, but the people don't. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, think back to that flat-pack furniture manual we started with. If a brilliant scholar in 3rd century India recognized that true passion completely shatters our meticulous spreadsheets, our numerical categories, and our rigid rulebooks, why do we, in our modern era, still spend so much emotional energy trying to force our identities, our relationships, and our desires into neat little labeled boxes?
The great question.
We try to quantify everything, hoping it will give us control over the chaos of human connection. It's something for you to mull over the next time you find yourself trying to define exactly what you're looking for. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.